Limited capability for work and work-related activity. My name's Danielle Zider. I'm the Pro Bono Manager at Access Social Care and I'm responsible for the day-to-day running of the clinic. If you've got any questions, then please don't hesitate to contact me on either my email address or telephone number set out in this slide. Employment Support Allowance and Universal Credit. Generally, there's an expectation that someone who receives an income replacement benefit or means-tested benefit, such as Job Seekers Allowance or Universal Credit, will look for work whilst receiving the benefit. Before the claimant starts receiving the benefit, they're expected to sign a claimant commitment, which sets out how many hours a week they spend job seeking, how many applications they'll make each week, where they'll look for job adverts, etc. If the claimant does not comply with their claimant commitment, they may be sanctioned and their benefit may be temporarily reduced or even stopped, depending on the level of the offence. People of working age who have an illness, health condition or disability that makes it difficult or impossible to work may be entitled to Employment Support Allowance, also known as ESA, or Universal Credit, UC, if they're assessed as having limited capability for work or a limited capability for work-related activity. People who are assessed as having a limited capability for work will have a less onerous claimant commitment than people who don't. They may be required to do activities such as interview training workshops, work experience, or attend work-focused interviews at the job centre. People who receive ESA and have limited capability for work are placed in the work-related activity group. Those with limited capability for work-related activity are not required to do any type of work-related activity or job seeking, but will still receive their benefit in full. People who receive ESA and have limited capability for work-related activity are placed in the support group. They have a support group component added to their weekly benefit. There are two types of ESA: income-related ESA, which is means-tested, and new style ESA, which was previously known as contributory ESA, which is based on national insurance contributions. It's no longer possible to make a new claim for income-related ESA. Instead, you must make a claim for Universal Credit. People who are currently on income-related ESA will continue to receive it until they have a change of circumstances, such as moving house or moving in with a partner, at which point they will need to make an application for Universal Credit, or they're invited to apply for Universal Credit, and this is known as managed migration. The managed migration process was paused during the pandemic and is not expected to resume until at least April 2022. A person is likely to be in a better position if they move to Universal Credit through the managed migration rather than due to a change of circumstances, because if the amount of Universal Credit you receive is less than your current ESA award, you'll receive a transitional element to your Universal Credit, so you're not worse off than you would have been if you'd stayed on ESA. However, if you move on to Universal Credit because of a change of circumstances, there's no transitional element, so you're likely to be worse off as a result of that move onto Universal Credit. It's still possible to claim new style ESA if you've made sufficient national insurance contributions. The legal framework will depend on which benefit you are applying for or appealing, but the provisions for limited capability for work and limited capability for work-related activity are mirrored in each of the sets of legislation. So for New Style Employment and Support Allowance, it's the Welfare Reform Act 2012 and the Employment and Support Allowance Regulations 2013. For income-related ESA. It's the Welfare Reform Act 2007 and the Employment and Support Allowance Regulations 2008. And for universal credit, it's the Universal Credit Regulations 2013. It's a points-based system, which is set out in Appendix 3 of the Volunteer Handbook, which you should have access to. The activities are divided into two broad sections. There's the physical functions, and then there's the mental, cognitive, and intellectual functions. Each activity is divided into different descriptors, which explain related tasks of varying degrees of difficulty. These have scores ranging from 0 to 15 points, and a claimant must score at least 15 points to be deemed to have limited capability for work. Points are awarded when the claimant is not able to perform a task described safely to an acceptable standard, as often as needed and in a reasonable time. Here is a list of physical activities that are considered when deciding whether a person has limited capability for work. Each activity has a number of descriptors, and each descriptor has a number of points allocated to it. The descriptor which is the most appropriate to the person's circumstances and which has the highest number of points will be allocated to the claimant for each activity. The claimant needs at least 15 points to be assessed as having limited capability for work. The first activity is Mobilizing Unaided and considers how far a person can move safely and repeatedly on level ground without needing to stop. It also considers whether the claimant could descend 2 steps unaided by another person. The assessor can take into consideration whether the person could carry out the activity using an aid such as crutches or a wheelchair, even if the individual chooses not to use these aids. Therefore, if a person doesn't use aids, they may need to justify why they choose not to use them. The second activity is Standing and Sitting and looks at whether the individual can move from one seat to another unaided and how long the individual can stay sitting or standing without experiencing significant discomfort. The next activity is Reaching and looks at whether the individual can carry out activities which involve raising their hands above their waist. The next activity is Picking up things, such as a carton of liquid or an empty cardboard box, using their upper body and either arm. The next activity is Manual Dexterity and considers activities such as picking up a coin using their fingers and using a computer mouse. Next is whether the individual can convey a message using verbal or non-verbal means, such as speaking, writing, or typing. Next, looks at whether the individual is able to understand a message from another person using verbal or non-verbal means of communication, such as speech, lip reading, or reading. The next activity is Navigating and Maintaining Safety and considers whether the individual can get around familiar or unfamiliar surroundings safely on their own or using a guide dog. The next activity considers whether the individual has any issues with incontinence or with the leakage of a collecting device such as a colostomy bag. The final physical activity is Consciousness during waking moments and considers whether the individual experiences voluntary loss of consciousness once a week, in which case they'll score 15 points, or once a month, in which case they will score 6 points. Next are the mental, cognitive and intellectual functions activities. The first activity is Learning Tasks and looks at whether an individual can carry out tasks such as learning how to set an alarm clock or set a washing machine to clean clothes. The next activity is Awareness of Everyday Hazards and looks at whether an individual is able to understand the risks involved with carrying out certain activities. Next looks at initiating and completing personal actions and looks at whether an individual can carry out two sequential activities, such as cleaning their teeth and then brushing their hair. Next looks at coping with change and whether an individual can cope with changes to a pre-existing arrangement or to their usual routine. Next looks at getting about and whether an individual can get about whether the individual can get about to a specified place in an unfamiliar environment, or whether they'd be able to cope if they were in a familiar environment. Next looks at coping with social engagement and whether the individual has any difficulties with engaging with others. Finally, the last mental, cognitive and intellectual function activity is appropriateness of behavior and whether the individual would behave appropriately in the workplace. This is looking specifically at aggressive behavior or disinhibited behavior. This slide shows an example of how different points are awarded for a particular activity. And in this example, the activity is learning tasks. So as you can see, if a person cannot learn how to complete a simple task, such as setting an alarm clock, the individual will be awarded 15 points. If they're awarded 15 points for this activity, then they'll also be put into the limited capability for work-related activity group. This means that an extra component will be added to their benefit, but it also means that they won't be required to undertake work-related activity in order to receive their benefit each week. If a person can't learn anything beyond a simple task, such as setting an alarm clock, then they'll be awarded 9 points. And if they can't learn anything beyond a moderately complex task, such as the steps involved in operating a washing machine, they'll be awarded 6 points. If none of the above apply, then they'll be awarded 0 points. Discussing the activities and descriptors with clients and/or their families. Currently, the majority of our clients have learning disabilities. Therefore, they're more likely to score points for the mental, cognitive and intellectual function activities. However, all the activities should be explored with them or their families in case their health condition or disability impacts on them in ways that you haven't considered. Sensitivity is required, as often this will be the first time that families or the claimant have come across the descriptors and activities. Often they'll have been applying on the misunderstanding that ESA, or limited capability for work, is awarded for certain disabilities or conditions, rather than how that condition affects their ability to carry out the activities. The limited capability for work activities focus on the things that individuals can't do or find challenging to do without support. It can be difficult for individuals and their families to go from trying to be positive and having a can-do attitude to temporarily focusing on the things that the individual can't do. Therefore, they may require gentle questioning from you to think about or raise issues that can be problematic or particularly sensitive, such as problems going to the toilet or situations which may result in challenging behaviour. Examples of phrases which can be helpful are things such as, on a bad day, if your helper wasn't there, what would you do, on a difficult day. It's important that you acknowledge the difficulty in thinking about all the negative issues that affect the person. It can be helpful to ask the client or their family if they're able to keep a daily diary for a week. This helps to think about the issues that the person has with carrying out certain everyday tasks and allows them to think about the adaptations that they make to help them to carry out the task or the support that they need from family members. Often, because people have been living with their conditions for so long, things that an outsider may consider as being unusual or taking time as something that the family have just learnt to live with, and so they don't realise that it isn't normal to carry out an activity in a particular way or for it to take as long as it takes the individual. And so a diary can help them to focus on that and can be a useful source of evidence when you're preparing the submissions to appeal a decision. As we've seen, the points-based system for assessing limited capability for work is fairly specific, and there may be individuals who don't have issues with those particular activities, but due to their health condition would still find it difficult to carry out work-related activities. People will automatically be treated as having limited capability for work in some situations, such as when they have a terminal illness or if they have cancer requiring chemotherapy or radiotherapy, or they require regular dialysis. However, sometimes a person might not score 15 points, but will still be treated as having limited capability for work due to exceptional circumstances. Therefore, as well as always thinking about the activities and descriptors, you should also consider the following regulations. Regulation 29(2)B of the ESA Regulations 2008 for income-related ESA, Regulation 25 of the ESA Regulations 2013 for New Style ESA, and Schedule 8, paragraphs 4 and 5 of the Universal Credit Regulations for Universal Credit. The regulations all mirror each other, and they say that if the claimant doesn't score sufficient points to be considered as having limited capability for work, they'll still be treated as such if they have a life-threatening disease or there's a substantial risk. This means that they suffer from some specific bodily or mental disablement, which means there would be a substantial risk to their health or the health of another person if they were found not to have limited capability for work. In assessing whether the risk is substantial, regard should be had to both the likelihood of an occurrence and the nature of the harm that might result in the event of an occurrence. In one upper tribunal case, an increase in the frequency of exacerbations of pain was sufficient to count as substantial harm. If the claimant is found to have limited capability for work, the assessor then needs to consider whether the claimant also has limited capability for work-related activity. This is done during the same work capability assessment. And if one or more of the descriptors listed in the ESA Regulations 2008 Schedule 3, the ESA Regulations 2013 Schedule 3, or the Universal Credit Regulations Schedule 7 apply, the claimant will be assessed as having limited capability for work-related activity. For ESA, this will place the claimant in the support group, and they'll receive an additional component in their weekly benefit. For Universal Credit, they'll also receive a work capability amount. They'll not be expected to take part in any work-related activity for ESA purposes or work-related requirements for Universal Credit. And for people who receive contributory ESA, now known as New Style ESA, they'll be able to stay on ESA for as long as they meet the support group requirements. For people who get New Style ESA and are just in the work-related activity group, they're limited to 12 months on ESA. As the list of activities is so descriptive, there's also an exception rule for being treated as having limited capability for work-related activity, and that's found in Regulation 35 of the ESA Regulations 2008 for income-related ESA, Regulation 31 of the ESA Regulations 2013 for New Style ESA, and Schedule 9 of the Universal Credit Regulations 2013 for Universal Credit. The claimant is treated as having limited capability for work-related activity if a failure to treat them in this way would mean there's a substantial risk to the mental or physical health of a person if they weren't put into the support group or treated as having limited capability for work-related activity. This can be the case where, for example, a person would be required to attend work-focused interviews or carry out a work-related activity, and due to their condition, being in an unfamiliar environment or having changes to their routine, being around unfamiliar people, for example, would have a very significant impact on their behaviour, maybe if they suffered from extreme anxiety, or there's some other factors which could lead to challenging behaviour, which could be difficult and cause a risk to the general public or to the individual themselves. We come across the situation where a claimant may have been assessed as having limited capability for work, but not found to have limited capability for work-related activity, and they want to challenge the decision not to be assessed as having limited capability for work-related activity. Appealing that decision puts the whole award at risk because the tribunal has the power to look at the whole decision, so could reverse the decision toward limited capability for work. Therefore, we would only recommend that somebody goes ahead with such an appeal if there's fairly compelling evidence that they should have been awarded limited capability for work-related activity. As we've discussed, the reason why a person might want to go ahead with that type of appeal is because the conditions for claimants with limited capability for work-related activity are better, as there's no requirement to participate in work-related activities. They'll also be financially better off because an additional component is added to their benefit if they're found to have limited capability for work-related activity. And if you're on new style ESA, you can only get that for 12 months if you're in the work-related activity group, whereas there's no end date if you're put into the support group and found to have limited capability for work-related activity. Finally, here's an overview of the appeal process for ESA and limited capability for work. The individual will apply for the benefit. When the claim is disallowed, they have 1 month from the date of the decision letter to ask for a mandatory reconsideration from the DWP. If the mandatory reconsideration is turned down, then they have 1 month from the date of the mandatory reconsideration decision letter to appeal to the tribunal. The DWP has 1 month from receiving notification of the appeal to send through their bundle. It's at this point that Access volunteers will generally get involved to register as representatives, which doesn't mean that you have to attend the hearing, but it means that you'll receive copies of all the relevant paperwork. You should review the DWP bundle and then contact the client or their family to discuss which descriptors may apply and if there's anyone who may be able to provide supporting evidence. You should write out for supporting evidence as soon as possible. Once this is received, you can then start drafting the submissions, which are the written arguments as to why the appeal should be allowed, and send that to the tribunal with the additional evidence as soon as it's finalised. The hearing will then take place. This can be over the phone, by video conference, paper hearing, so just on the basis of the papers that have been submitted by the DWP and the client and us, or our preferred option is to go for a face-to-face hearing, as this is the one most likely to result in a positive outcome for the client. I hope that you found this training video useful, but if you do have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you.